because since I have been down south, I have found out the American people don't realize that these Senate hearings are not spontaneous like you and I are sitting here talking. These Senate hearings are as much rehearsed as any play on Broadway. In other words, these men have crews that go in, no, I shouldn't say crews, they have assistants, that go in and talk to whomever they are going to interview, and it's rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed, and then they put it on camera. Now, people down south don't realize that, and apparently most of the people in America don't realize that this is not a spontaneous thing, that it is just as much rehearsed as any play or anything could be. Now, I cannot see if it were a spontaneous operation, if they were sitting there and asking these people questions spontaneously like you and I are talking, I could see much more reason for it. Now, the American people are sick and fed up with Watergate, and they don't want to hear about it anymore. And they have cut all of their programs off, especially down here in the South. They couldn't care less. There are only two cities that are keeping this thing going, plus the press, and that's Washington and New York. And outside of Washington and New York, you don't hear about the Watergate other than when I pick up your papers down here or pick up magazines with Southern letters, people from the South that have written in letters. We're sick of the Watergate. Shut the mess up. So what? What they did to me in California was a heck of a lot worse than any body breaking into Democratic headquarters. They didn't steal anything. They didn't hurt anybody. They didn't kidnap anybody. I was kidnapped in California.
Okay, well, my name is Mae Brussel, and I live in Carmel, California. And I recently published an article in The Realist, I'll hold a copy for you, called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And the article is in a magazine that's known for its satire and its comedy. Paul Krasner has published satire for the last 12 years, going on 13 years. And it was published in The Realist as a very serious article on a condition which is existing in America today. And the crux of that condition is epitomized, in my mind and in Paul Krasner's mind, in the story of Martha Mitchell's handling after the Watergate arrest in Washington, D.C. And I have a sentence in The Realist that said, the manner in which Martha was handled simply indicates how the fascist police agents are forced to treat any witness to their espionage acts. Parts of the invisible government that exist in America today were visible to Martha Mitchell, and she panicked. Martha has to be a political prisoner because she was a witness to some kind of dirty work. This article was published, I finished writing it July the 13th, and the dirty work I was speaking about was the break-in at the Watergate Hotel where Martha and John Mitchell live, and an agent of James McCord, who was arrested at the Watergate Hotel, was hired by John Mitchell's committee to re-elect Richard Nixon as to be chief of security for that committee, and he was arrested at the Watergate Hotel breaking into the Democratic headquarters.
Hollywood actress Julia Roberts will play this lady, Martha Mitchell, in an upcoming TV series on Starz called Gaslit. Now, many people will ask, who was Martha Mitchell and what was her connection to Arkansas, especially when they see the Martha Mitchell Expressway off Highway 65 in Pine Bluff. Now, she was very well connected to President Richard Nixon and also played a role in his resignation. So tonight, I'm answering the question, who is the woman behind the name Martha Mitchell?
She picked this wallpaper out when she got married for her wedding reception, the first wedding.
86-year-old Bob Abbott of Pine Bluff knows a lot about Martha Beale Mitchell and this historic house. He bought her childhood home in 1975, but wasn't sure what to do with it. But when Mitchell died a year later, reporters from around the world came to Pine Bluff.
And many of them wanted to go through the old house. And I knew then that was a lot more history than I really knew about.
Which is how it became a museum. What does this home mean to the community?
Well, I think every town should have something that would reflect her history.
Mitchell was born and grew up in Pine Bluff. In 1957, she married John Mitchell. He became U.S. Attorney General under President Richard Nixon. Mrs. Mitchell was famous for calling news reporters with political gossip she got from spying on her husband.
Anytime you turned TV on Martha Mitchell, they were talking about Martha Mitchell. She was big time.
Mitchell blew the whistle on Watergate. She publicly blamed Nixon for the break-in and cover-up at the Democratic National Headquarters and accused his administration, among other things, of kidnapping her to stop her from talking. This is a statement from the Slate podcast, Slow Burn.
And that was the beginning of my being held a prisoner.
When she was freed, she said she stayed quiet in her apartment while the White House was working to discredit her.
These White House rumors are persistent. Martha Mitchell's crazy. Martha Mitchell's an alcoholic. And it added to the beautiful little story.
In the end, the Watergate scandal ruined her marriage and Nixon resigned.
There is nothing that I did in Washington that I would not do again today.
Turns out she was being truthful with what she was saying.
As the big flower said on her grave, Martha was right. It's a 1940 model, and we can hook it up and got gas in it.
Bob says there was a time Martha was more popular than the president.
And that was amazing to me.
You know, that is amazing, but what's amazing now is so many people don't know her.
That's right. That's exactly right.
But many people do know the Martha Mitchell Expressway off Highway 65. There because Abbott pushed for it.
You can almost tell it.
Now, nearly a century later,
you can see all this stuff here.
He's ready to sell this house. His daughter says it's time.
I personally want to see someone that can take it over and can really do something major with it. It has so much possibilities.
You have never charged a dime.
Never charged a dime.
But you have sunk in so much money into it.
We won't talk about that. That hurts.
But what doesn't hurt is knowing this home has preserved a legacy and a critical moment in history. Martha Mitchell died in 1976, and her husband, John Mitchell, went to prison for his role in the Watergate scandal the following year. I'm told the Star's TV series, Gaslit, is completed production and will air sometime next year.
What a fascinating story.
It is fascinating, and it's funny, too, that, you know, you ask some people, and they say, oh, I remember it vividly.
Yeah.
And then other people, it's like, who's Martha Mitchell?
But more popular than...
At the time.
At the time, the Nixon.
Yeah, oh, yeah, she did a lot of talking.
Apparently, yeah.
She was considered, now, they called her this, the mouth of the South.
The mouth of the South.
That's how much talking she did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
people liked her.
Great story, very fascinating.
Thank you.
Watergate Hotel breaking into the Democratic headquarters. That evening, the weekend of the robbery, they called it a robbery. It was a clandestine, covert activity. That weekend, the Mitchells were in California. They were not at their hotel in Washington. They were in California. That does not mean that Mr. Mitchell wouldn't know that they were going to enter the Watergate. He may or may not have known. But they were in California. But the phones began ringing, or people came in to their place, and Martha Mitchell realized that she had seen dirty things, and she panicked, and she called Helen Thomas, the UPI, and said, I saw dirty tricks. I know of dirty tricks. Politics is a cop and robbers game. I want my husband to resign and get out of politics. Well, she was talking on the telephone when a gentleman from the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, an agent, went into her room and yanked the phone off the wall. And they ripped that phone off the wall. They ripped the phone off of her daughter's wall. And no more was heard about Martha Mitchell until she reached the UPI again and said that 5 men had held her down and beaten her up, and that she had stitches, and that she was injected with a fluid against her wishes. And Martha Mitchell reappeared in Rye, New York. The time sequence is uncertain, whether she was awake when she was transported or asleep. She surfaced 3 months later. This was June when she said that. She surfaced 3 months later in September, because the man who did the kicking to her and knocked her through a plate glass window, Steve King,
Mr. President, he has been protected under no uncertain circumstances. And as I told you a few minutes ago, that when I asked him, he said to me that if anything happened to Mr. President, the whole country would fall apart. And if you remember, A few weeks ago, I suggested that Mr. President resign. Well, it's a darn better idea that he resign than be impeached.
This was June when she said that she serviced 3 months later in September, because the man who did the kicking to her and knocked her through a plate glass window, Steve King, was promoted to chief of security for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon after he had held her down while a doctor injected a fluid into her behind. And she had 6 stitches in one finger, 5 stitches in the other. Her hands may be permanently stiff. She can't wear her wedding ring, and she was thrown through glass and stomped on. She couldn't see her husband for 24 hours. She didn't know where he was. And John Mitchell was out in California with Martha Mitchell while this was taking place. She has involved her daughter, which is something a person or a family seldom does, and said, ask Marty if Steve King isn't the man who did the ripping off the telephone cord. So she has involved her own daughter into this process because she knows that she's right. Now, John Mitchell was somewhere at the hotel in California at the same time she was, and staying at the hotel with her was Patrick Gray III, the acting head of the FBI. And Patrick Gray III told the news media that he didn't know that John Mitchell was at the hotel at the same time he was, that while it was a large hotel, they had different rooms. But it would be interesting to know if John Mitchell didn't see his wife for at least a minimum of 24 hours while she was being brutalized.
About 400 people in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, turned out this morning to pay their final respects to Martha Mitchell. Many remember when she was growing up here. And some close friends came from out of town, among them Cornelia Wallace, wife of Alabama Governor George Wallace. 6 of the most prominent men in Pine Bluff served as pallbearers. The ceremony was kept simple and brief on the orders of Mrs. Mitchell's estranged husband, former Attorney General John Mitchell. He made a quiet entrance at the side of the church, away from reporters and photographers. Later, he was accompanied to the graveside by the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Marty, and by Mrs. Mitchell's son of a previous marriage, Clyde Jennings. Martha Mitchell will be remembered best as an outspoken woman, one of the first people to accuse President Nixon of involvement in the Watergate scandal. Her candor got her in trouble with the Nixon administration and with her own husband. But it earned her many admirers back at home. Some of them sent flowers. One arrangement in white chrysanthemums spelled out this message: Martha was right. There was no card. George Lewis, NBC News, Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
Where was John Mitchell, what room, if he wasn't with Patrick Gray? Because the commotion of the men being arrested at the Watergate was going on. I got interested in the Watergate affair that I wrote about. The article in The Realist is broken into 3 parts, and each part is equally important to this entire nation at this time. The first part is the Watergate affair regarding Martha Mitchell and the fascist government, because we have 2 governments, one visible and one invisible, and the invisible government is surfacing all the time if people would be aware of it. The second, it surfaced in the Watergate affair. It's the best view of the espionage, clandestine government that the United States has been able to view publicly. This is the first chance we've had. In a fascist state, in a total fascist state, you wouldn't get this glimpse. They'd all be carted away. But because there's a semblance of a democracy until next November, we have our last chance to view these operations, even in a superficial, small level. The first part of my article is on the Watergate affair. The second part is on the American assassin. And that's the creation of the motive for the news media of the American assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan Sirhan, Arthur Bramer. These men did not kill anybody. They are alleged assassins. They are patsies. And the news media has focused upon the fact that they were loners, each influencing the other.
I'll tase you. Do you understand me?
Bitch, if you tase me, that dog is going to eat your motherfucking ass.
Back up.
You hear me?
Back up
Put your
off
hands
me.